Hi and welcome to the third video where I'm discussing the live Q&A that Watcher, the new director of World of Warcraft, delivered on Blizzard's Twitch stream last week. Now I've portioned it into different sections because they've talked about a number of different things and some of them have gone on for a bit. So I've already done a couple. If you want to see the others I've been vlogging about, you can click the card in the top right and it'll take you to the playlist where I sort of respond to the sort of things that Blizzard come out with at conventions or on their own stream. So in this one, what I'm going to talk about is effectively group PvE. They've talked about dungeons and raids, and so that's what I'm going to do. The first thing to note, of course, is that in the next reset, we will have patch 7.1. There are a few things still to be fleshed out. We still can't be absolutely certain exactly what's happening. One thing we do know is that Karazhan will be coming out. Now, for Karazhan, they have said that there is an attunement for it, but that attunement will be account-wide. Now, remember, there are a few attunements that are becoming account-wide that weren't when Legion launched. So, for example, attuning yourself to Court of Stars and Archway normally requires a bit of a rep grind with Nightfallen and then some quite significant quest chains, including a right bugger at the end. Now, as long as you've done it on one character, come patch 7.1, all of your characters will be attuned for those dungeons. The same applies to World Quests, in fact. That's not so much of a pain, really. But there is an advantage in not having to do all the reps for World Quests when you get an alt level cap. It means you don't have to do a reasonable amount in each zone, because at the moment, if you want to get into World Quest really quickly at level cap, it means making sure you do a decent amount in each of the 4 leveling zones to get at least friendly with those factions. You might spend longer in one zone than another, but do enough to at least get friendly. Then at level cap, go to Suramar, get friendly with Nightfall, and that might take about an hour, depends on competition for mobs and so on. And then your World Quest. Well, the advantage of this is it means that you can do whatever zone you like. Whatever zone you like. You might not like Stormhammer. I love it, but you might not. You might miss it out entirely. It's your decision. So yeah, so certain attunements are becoming account-wide. Now, although Karazhan is coming out as soon as 7.1 comes out, the other stuff is not. The raids are not. Trials of Valor is going to come out a couple of weeks after that. So if you're still working on whatever mode of Emerald Nightmare that you're working on, you've got another couple of weeks where you've got this reset and another couple of resets to try and get that tidied up before Trial of Valor. Of course, Trials of Valor is only like 3 bosses anyway. How difficult those 3 bosses are, I don't know. But it is only 3 bosses, and it's a stopgap raid that's just there to tidy up a storyline. I don't think, looking at the mechanics, it's going to be the most involved of fights. Who knows? And then Nighthold is going to come out early 2017. Early 2017 doesn't necessarily mean straight away in 2017. It might not be until like late January or early February or something like that. We still don't know on that one. So if we take dungeons first of all, because dungeons are the first sort of content we went into. So what they've talked about, again, they are trying to... Legion is very much an expansion of class fantasy. That phrase. I never thought I'd hate to hear developers talking about class fantasy as a sort of, someone more of a role-playing leaning myself. But I do. So what they've talked about is the fact that, oh yeah, your class might not be great for that sort of content, but do you know what, it's really good for this. Or, yeah, your class might be really good for that content, but there's a trade-off because it's not so good for that. The problem with that thinking is it assumes we do all the content and that we want to do all the content equally. Well, we don't. We prefer some types of content. And it's a bit like saying, well, we're going to snooker your class on that, but we're going to justify it by saying you'll be good at a type of content you're not that bothered about. But yeah, so with dungeons, what they've said is, of course, a lot of people will focus on the AoE aspects of dungeons for beating the timers. I would argue whether you're beating the timers, wanting to beat the timers or not, you're going to focus at the very least on cleave. I take cleave talents into my dungeons, whether I'm just doing a basic mythic dungeon to get a keystone for an alt or something really quickly, or whether I'm doing boosts for like low level keys, or whether I'm doing the high level number, plus 10 to get the decent gear in my cache the next week. My talents might change a little bit from dungeon to dungeon, but from mode to mode, like level to level, not really. It's the same things required. Sometimes a bit of variation depending on the affixes, of course. But generally speaking, cleave is king. So what they've said is, in terms of Shadow Priest, because, you can't have failed to notice that if you've got Shadow Priest players in your guild who know how to play that spec really well, they can do stonking damage. We're not saying they're flying away at the top on every fight, but on a lot of fights they are. They're very, very strong. It's all based around the Surrender to Madness. Now, of course, the Surrender to Madness, I talked about that in the class balance video in the last one, so I don't want to go too much into that. But what they've said is that's not necessarily going to help them in a dungeon. So the AoE is not so strong in a dungeon. There's your trade-off. Well, yeah, I don't think it is, as I say, much of a trade-off, because if you're a Shadow Priest, I mean, the implication is that they're weaker in dungeons, but then they said themselves, oh, but we noticed Shadow Priests doing really well in plus 15s. They're doing plus 15s. So they're not weak, are they then? So I really don't know what they were trying to get across there. But they did make one important point, and this is a very valid point. I'm going to absolutely back them up on this one. At the same time, they sort of say it as if they can't do anything about it. They say it doesn't matter if you or your spec is perceived as weak by the community. If you are perceived as weak, then you're not going to be able to get into that content. This is certainly true, and it has been true. I mean, quite to speak as a Ret Paladin, I remember, I probably mentioned this story before, going back to Hellfire Citadel, to the first couple of weeks, like a week or two of Mythic, I had to go on holiday. It was summer, I had to go on holiday. Not my choice. But that put a bit of a crimp to my gearing. So I thought I at least want to get an Archimon kill when I came back, because my guild had already cleared it a couple of times. I at least want to get an Archimon kill for the ring upgrade, for Legendary Ring. Or not the... Was it? No, I didn't have the ring then. It must have been actual full clear to get the book things for the ring. That was right. And so I thought normal mode will do. Just a normal mode. So I went onto Group Finder and got, found a normal mode that was looking for DPS. I thought, invite me, please. No. Why? Because I'm a Ret. I was a Ret with mythic kills to my name, and I would have bossed the damage in that group. But Ret, so, I know there's some people who found the same thing in Legion. I know that there are people who have got mythic kills by their name in Legion, and they can't get invited as DPS into even low-level mythic dungeon things in the Group Finder. Which is why, of course, most people in raiding guilds, instead of actually trying to do it in the Group Finder, will just get across the party themselves and then find people with a keystone in Group Finder. Seems to be the way to do it. You can't actually get a group yourself. That's just how it seems to have worked out. So yeah, I absolutely agree that, the community can perceive your spec as being bad, but then I think they have to ask the question, why would that be, and then try and counter it. Because, you can't expect like millions of people all collective to sort themselves out. Blizzard needs to be a sort of leading light, I feel, in that area, even if they're just facilitating other members of the community to try and highlight that. Into Mythic Plus dungeons, because Mythic Plus, of course, opened up at the same time as sort of raids. And what they've said is, in terms of a few quality of life things, really, there is a situation at the moment where you go into a Mythic Plus, now you're up against the clock. Anything, you don't beat the clock, that's it. Your Mythic Keystone is depleted. You're a bit snookered. And then you disconnect. That's pretty bad luck, isn't it? The moment you're scuppered, it sounds like in the short term, at least, you're still going to be scuppered, but they do acknowledge that it can be a pretty frustrating thing to have that happen. Now, they've said they've not really been able to think of alternatives that couldn't be abused, because there are potential abuses. For example, you might have a situation where you invite someone into your group with a keystone. You as a guild group do these things. And as soon as they're in and you've started it up, you boot them and then invite someone else from your guild to finish it off. And the poor old guy whose keystone it was gets nothing. Obviously, they don't want a situation where that can ever possibly be the case. So at the moment, what they're basically saying is it's a tricky one to solve. So in the meantime, it may well be that there isn't a solution to it in sight. So if you are prone to disconnecting, and what they've also said is if there was a system to restore the keystone, then people might just get into a situation where they know they're not going to beat the timer or not do as well as they want. They pretend to disconnect and then go through the restoration to try it again, which again would be an abuse of the system. So they don't want to invite that sort of behaviour. And that is understandable. I'm going to have to say I agree with that. I can well understand that it's super frustrating. But I would also think the vast majority of people who are going to be doing these runs are not the sort of people who would have a connection that would be that unstable. So you could put it down to stunningly bad luck, and it might stuff you over for a week. But not necessarily. Remember, what you get out of your cash is not based on what level you get your keystone up. It's what level you complete on anyone's keystone. In terms of Mythic Plus item level, they said there's no plan to increase the reward, the cap, on that reward when Trial of Valor comes out, but there is when Nighthold comes out. But remember, Nighthold is not coming out for a few more months. How many months we don't know, but at least it's next year. We know it's 2017. But yeah, when Nighthold comes out, it will be increased, but at the moment it won't. I think they also talked about the fact that, the way it might be increased is by, at the moment, plus 10 is the maximum item level on any gear. So if you do a plus 11 or a plus 12, you're doing it for kudos, really, and plus 15, of course, because it's an achievement for which you can get a skin unlock. But what they've said is that the way they could boost that up is by allowing those higher level Mythic Pluses to drop the increased item level, rather than just increasing the base item level of all the levels at which you can currently get it. Now, that's in terms of dungeons. In terms of raids, of course, Mythic Emerald Nightmare. Now, they had to, of course, talk about this a little bit because it was a bit of a damp squib in many ways. So what they've said is Xavius on Mythic difficulty was not tuned to the level the team would have wanted. They said they wanted it to take a couple of days with about 80 to 100 attempts for the top guilds. It certainly is a much more straightforward boss. My previous guild, Just Move Guild, my previous guild, they spent a few nights on Cenarius, 2.5 nights, something like that on Cenarius, and then about 7 pulls on Xavius. Yeah. So, and other guilds as well. I mean, they were sort of killing Cenarius, took so many times on Cenarius, because Cenarius is a genuinely difficult fight. That one is very much worth it. And then you get onto Xavius, and the whole thing rolls over pretty quickly. They said the rest of the zone had a nice ramp up of difficulty. I've already done a video sort of reviewing Emerald Nightmare. I am sort of happy with the design of Emerald Nightmare in isolation. The raid itself, I think, was pretty good. What I am less impressed with is the fact that it is being completed so quickly. There are a number of issues around that. I'm not going to go through all of them here. It's not really the time. But it should have been more difficult to do it. Now, the reason it wasn't more difficult to do was got nothing to do with the raid itself, and entirely to do with the fact that it was possible to have roughly equal gear to what the stuff dropped before you ever entered that raid, which has never happened before. The idea that you can kill the bosses and it drops stuff, and like everyone's going, well, that's not, if they'd really geared up in like dungeons beforehand, they could be looking at it and going, it's not an upgrade, don't need it, and you're disenchanting it. That's an extreme case, but it's the sort of thing that's possible. But what they did say is, they said the goal with Xavius wasn't to make a Manaroth or Archimon difficulty boss. It's the first raid tier of an expansion with a lot more to follow. And what they basically mean by that, it makes sense. Yes, Manaroth and Archimon needed to be really difficult because at the time, you've got to remember in WoD, it was a very different thing, Hellfire Citadel. They knew, at the point at which Hellfire Citadel was being designed, they sort of knew that this was it. They'd abandoned WoD. I don't think it was intended to be the last tier, but they'd given up because they thought, we need to focus on Legion because we've completely cocked WoD up. So they abandoned it, which meant they needed to make those last 2 bosses really tough because they also knew that Hellfire Citadel was going to be out for a good year. And it turned out to be more than a year. So certainly we wouldn't expect it to be that level of difficulty. That would be we don't want the first raid to be out for months and months and months. But at the same time, it should have taken the top guilds the traditional couple of weeks, or reset and a bit at least, reset and a half maybe. We shouldn't have had a situation where after 2 weeks 100 guilds have cleared it all. That was a bit much. But again, it's a gearing issue. Now it says the top guilds, and again, this is perfectly true, but the top guilds now, when you say top guilds, it should really be like 10, 20. It says they're doing things that aren't representative of most of the players in the game. The team doesn't want to design for guilds that are doing several split clears and constant Mythic Plus dungeons. That's understandable, and it is absolutely the case that the very top guilds will, of course, do everything they can to make sure they are as geared and otherwise prepared as possible for these raids. However, even like serious raid guilds that were not raiding in daytime, that were still just sticking to a normal evening schedule, were still able to clear it very quickly within 2 or 3 weeks. And they are, although may or may not, some of them are not even doing split runs, but would compensate by doing more Mythic Plus dungeons. Some are doing split runs and maybe don't do as many Mythic Plus dungeons. These guilds that have already killed it, that have maybe killed it more recently, are not the sort of ones that have been spending all their lives in these dungeons and doing all this extreme stuff. That's all. Been doing more. I've certainly done more in the first month than I've ever had to do in the first month of an expansion before. Although, and even I didn't do as much as some people did because I had work to fit around it. Yes, certainly we did more, but it shouldn't have been possible. They should have been able to do something about that. But anyway, they are certainly true that the top guilds are taking advantage of a lot more stuff than most people would normally do. It says there are plenty of people progressing through the raid at a steady rate and enjoying it. Absolutely. I think it's a very enjoyable raid. I've not heard too many disparaging comments about the content, I should say. I think it's very positive. I think people like it a lot. People like the artwork in there especially. I quite like everything about it. It's pretty decent. Apart from one thing, but we're going to come on to that because they talk about that in a bit. He said it would be tough to design a fight that feels out of reach for the top world guilds without making it frustrating for everyone else. Not always. Sometimes what you can do, and what they have done in the past, or they've moved away from it, fair enough, is you create tough DPS checks, such as Butcher in Highmoor. And that naturally creates a situation, because Butcher, for example, was not a difficult fight. Mechanically, it was not a very complex fight. It required coordination, sure. But the way that works, a DPS check, is that the very top guilds they have to have loads and loads of pulls on it because they need a perfect pull where everyone gets good RNG, or a lot of people get good RNG and stuff like that, so that they can make that DPS check with the lower gear. And then the ones who progress more slowly, they've naturally got a higher item level average in their raid, and they are more easily able to make that DPS check without quite such perfect play. So that sort of concept, which seems to be moved away from, I'm actually in favour of every now and then. Not on every boss, but a boss in the raid that is like that as a bit of a speed bump for the faster guilds, which is, you're sort of saying you can still do it, but you'll just have to have a really good pull. And then for the ones later on, it's still going to be tough for you, but you're not going to have to play perfectly because your gear will be better. That, I like that system. But they don't seem to have wanted to use that system. Because one of the biggest DPS checks, what did we have? We had Ursoc, which, okay, is a DPS check, but it wasn't that tough a DPS check. Again, because of the gear, potentially, we can get beforehand. Il'gynoth, there was, people were one-phasing it, so again, very tight DPS check to do that. But again, as soon as that was noted, they stopped that. They put a stop to that completely. So, They've said, again, comment here, in the long run, the team would like to find ways to disincentivize things that top guilds do, like split clears. And they have said this before, and I have a great deal of sympathy. This is not one of the things where I say Blizzard should do better, really, because it's very difficult. There are potential solutions to preventing split clears, but they're not necessarily the sort of thing Blizzard would want to do. I mean, one thing you could do, for example, it was sort of shot in the foot. I actually thought maybe personal loot was a route to this. But then they changed it so personal loot could be freely traded. That being said, with the idea with split clears, of course, those who don't know, is you level up several characters and then you say, let's say you're just doing 2 split clears, although the top guilds actually do 10 or more. But let's say you do 2, that's what our guild did. So you have an alt and you have your main, and what you do is you do a full run with half mains and half alts, and then you do another run with the other half of mains and the other half of alts. And what it means is you've got 2 full clears worth of gear spread amongst your raiders instead of just 1. So you get twice as much gear. And if they had, let's say they had a system of personal loot, and they said that for the first 2 weeks, there is no such thing as master loot. You cannot use master loot at all. They've already restricted master loot in Legion because you can only use master loot in a guild group now. I think I'm right in saying that. That pugs are sort of forced to use personal loot, really. So what you could say is for the first 2 weeks, there is no master loot, and that comes in the 3rd week. So that means the very top guilds will have to cope with personal loot. What that means is that it might still be worth doing split. That's the problem, you see, because then you have a situation where, let's say an alt gets it, you could get him to trade it to a member, but that alt would have to have had a higher item level item to be able to do that, which is probably unlikely. So it might be one way of disincentivizing that. So that's a possibility, but it's could well be that Blizzard just don't want to go that far. They don't want to remove master loot altogether. Even if it's just for the first 2 weeks, or even the first week, as it turns out, or even the first 24 hours, because that's how quickly they killed it this time. They probably won't for Nighthold. I'm guessing, well, there's more bosses in Nighthold for a start. Nearly twice as, no, there's 10 bosses in Nighthold, isn't there? But more bosses in Nighthold, and you would assume a bigger ramp up in difficulty for them. But yeah, they do note that, it says that players don't enjoy but feel like they need to do them. It's quite... I don't think anyone likes the concept of split runs. I'm not saying no one will, because someone will probably comment and say, well, actually, it's a good way for my alt to get some sneaky gear, or to get the achievements really quickly so I can get into alt pugs really quickly. Yeah, okay, there is that side to it. But I think certainly a lot of people, and I don't think it even matters at what level you're playing, a lot of people just find it a pain in the arse. It would be just much more chill, and they'll be able to prepare a lot better, in fact, if you were just focusing on one character. I certainly would have had mine better prepared if I was just focusing on one character. So yeah, they've said that it needs to be done without imposing restrictions on the average player who wants to run a raid on a few different characters or share loot around. So yeah, I mean, the only way I can think, as I said, is the forcing personal loot for 2 weeks. But again, it could well be that a lot of people just really wouldn't like that. Now, yeah, onto the trinkets we said about this. There is one aspect of Emerald Nightmare that I wasn't happy with, and I think a lot of people not, and I think Blizzard themselves are going to look at this, they've said, which is the trinkets. The trinkets have generally been, for some specs, not all, a bit cack, compared to the dungeon trinkets. Now, ordinarily in the past, when you might have had a raid trinket that wasn't that special, but the item level itself made it good, so you still wanted it. Whereas now, because dungeon trinkets can Titan Forge up to raid levels, you can do a dungeon in relatively modest gear and get like the equivalent of a mythic item in terms of a dungeon loot. And if the effect on that dungeon trinket is like really good, then that's actually better than getting a mythic trinket from Emerald Nightmare, which is a bit mad. So they have said that they're going to have a look at them if they're not as powerful as they should be, having a little look at that. That becomes complicated, though, when you're doing it like on the fly just for a patch, because, of course, there is a danger, and this has certainly happened in the past, that they tune it up to make it better than the dungeon equivalent, and then it turns out to be overpowered for a particular class or spec that can use that trinket. So it's a tricky one. The way trinkets are these days, it's very fun. It takes almost as much tuning as classes themselves. So I think that's a tricky one. I'm not sure I'll hold up much hope there, but it is certainly possible that they will revisit some of them. And then finally, they talked about bonus rolls. This is very much part of both Dungeons and Raids, really. So what they've talked about is the idea that when you've got a coin, they introduced coins a couple of expansions ago in MOP as a way of protecting you a little bit against bad luck. So it's like you do a run. I think it was mostly for the LFR crowd, but of course all levels of raiders appreciate them. And you don't get the loot you want, so you spend a coin and you might get it. The problem, and I said this at the time, I wasn't doing a channel at the time, but I said at the time, that the problem with it is you create a situation where people will feel that they ought to be getting loot with these coins. And sure enough, that's what's happened. If you look on forums, you'll get people complaining, oh, I never get any loot, never get any loot. And usually you'll look at their gear and it's quite evident they do get quite a bit. What they mean is they don't get a piece of loot for every coin they use. So it's like these people are disappointed, crushingly disappointed, not even moderately disappointed, crushingly disappointed every time they coin a boss and don't get the loot. Or even if they get loot and don't get the loot they want. Now, that sort of attitude I don't think can be helped. But what they have said is sometimes it feels like a bit of a kick in the teeth when you coin a boss and what you actually get is gold. Because it's a very small amount of gold, really. Compared with the amounts of gold we have now in the game, it's quite small. So what they've said is they would like to change the system so that your consolation prize is something of greater value, such as, say, artifact power. They did say all other rewards, but I think the artifact power, at the moment at any rate, would be the one that would be most appreciated. In time, I mean, we don't know where artifact power is going, but that's more for the next vlog I'll be doing, which I think will be Thursday as things go at the moment. But yeah, the artifact power from a coin when you don't get loot, even if it was only a small amount, like 4,000 or something, or what would you say, 1,000, maybe scaled up. So maybe if you've got like 600% at the moment, you get like 6,000 or 7,000, whatever. That would be better. But anyway, so those are my sort of comments on what they've had to say about Dungeons and Raids and what I sort of think as well. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you have, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share. If you want to see the other ones, as I say, click on the card in the top right. It'll take you to the playlist where I respond to various things that Blizzard say. And the next one will be coming out probably Thursday, maybe Friday. And until then, I'll see you later.